Conservatism, communism, and country music. Country music has long been associated with conservative politics. Think traditional family values, God, Christianity, pickup trucks on dirt roads, and, as of late, Trump. But this is a more recent evolution of country music. To understand the journey of country music, one must begin in the 1920s, when what would be referred to as country music really began. Country music can trace its roots to the blues, bluegrass, and African American gospel music. It is essentially American folk music. In fact, when it was first created, it was just referred to as folk music, and it wouldn't be until the 1950s when the term country would become popular. Ironically enough, considering how much the commercialization of the genre today is disliked, what really allowed country to become popular was the radio, and what helped the radio to become popular was country. In large southern cities in the 1920s, such as Nashville and Atlanta, country music was really able to take off due to a combination of recording studios, radio, publishing centers, and live tours. Country music also had several benefactors, although the famous ones are more heinous than heroes. One such example is Henry Ford, whose fascist ideology was behind his seemingly philanthropic passion. He believed that jazz was tearing America apart, and the more wholesome country would be more beneficial, which relates to his racist ideology. Country quickly took off as much of its music imagined the ideal of the simple, all-American life. Obviously, it was popular in the more rural parts of the country, particularly the South, as that's where it can trace its origins. But it also became pretty popular in richer urban areas where it allowed people to be nostalgic for a life they had most likely never lived. In fact, much of country's marketing, then as now, played off the idea of nostalgia. Country music, in many ways, is tied to the American dream and whiteness in America, which is what makes it so much more ironic that it would take less than 20 years for communism to plant its seed in the genre. Early country songs were hardly ever political, although the idea of outlaw has long existed throughout American folk music. But country music did happen to coincide with the rise of pop culture, which the Communist Party of America decided to take advantage of. Due to the Depression, socialism was on the rise throughout the country, and in 1935, the Popular Front was created to spread Marxism through pop culture to even more of the American populace. Pete Seeger, although not yet part of the Communist Party, learned of the idea through his father, and decided to take his passion for country music and use it to help the cause. It helped as well that the streak of rebellion necessary for an American to be a communist already was a staple of country music. He soon recruited Alan Lomax, the assistant director of the Library of Congress, allowing Seeger to listen to early and foundational recordings of American folk music. But things really took off in 1940 at a benefit for migrant workers in California, where Seeger met Woody Guthrie, a working-class musician from Oklahoma with limited success. Guthrie was not a communist, but he did sympathize with the cause. In 1941, the pair, along with Millard Lampole and Lee Hayes, created the group the Almanac Singers, helping to propel both Seeger and Guthrie into the spotlight. The band was famous for its anti-fascist, anti-war, pro-union, and pro-civil rights themes, as well as its connections to communism, which led to it being targeted due to the U.S. joining World War II. The band disbanded in 1942, but both Seeger and Guthrie continued to pursue musical careers. Woody Guthrie's solo career began to take off, something that wouldn't have been possible without Seeger. In 1950, Seeger created another band, the Weavers, with Lee Hayes, Ronnie Gilbert, and Fred Hellerman. But it wasn't long afterwards that both Seeger and Hayes were blacklisted for being communists, and the band was banned from radios, as were their songs. It wasn't until the 1960s that these restraints would be lifted, putting a pretty heavy damper on Seeger's career. But despite this, his music continues to be popular and has often been covered, most effectively by the Kingston Trio in 1962 with the song Where Have All the Flowers Gone, which helped to lift the ban. Pete Seeger's version of communism is important and interesting to mention when discussing his use of the ideology in his music. Despite its capitalist bourgeoisie founders, Seeger believed America was, at its root, a communist entity. At best, this assumption is laughable. At worst, it makes Seeger seem an idiot. But it explains why so many of his works are unabashedly patriotic, almost nationalistic, which inherently counters communist ideology. He was also known to be a supporter of Stalin, which he later lacklusterly apologized for in his 1997 autobiography. Pete Seeger's history can most simply be described as tumultuous and his ideology as colonizer communism. But there can be no doubt in the effect of his use of leftist politics and music, that his use of leftist politics and music would have on the industry. However, these politics would not keep their hold in the country genre. The eventual conservatization of country can largely be attributed to the conservative President Nixon, who used country music in his campaign. His efforts to promote the genre, and in turn his popularity, continued on into his presidency, culminating in a National Country Month and an album dedicated to the president. It is also important to note the effect the civil rights movement had on the South and its politics. Previous to the 1950s and 60s, the South was mostly made up of those in support of strong federal government, but after the passing of the Civil Rights Acts, conspiracies around and hate of big government grew. Racism, as it always has and still does, played a humongous role in the politics of the white South and contributed largely to the conservatization of their music. The alignment of country music with Nixon, and thus with conservatism, began to force the genre away from its proletariat storytelling roots, and more into a music of upholding traditional and oftentimes outdated ideals. This did not pass without notice of any of the big names within country, who lamented the change. An example of this is Waylon Jennings' 1995 song, Are You Sure Hank Done It This Way?, which compares Hank Williams' style of music to the new style of country Jennings saw around him. But despite how easily the general Southern populace took hold of conservative views, it took much longer for a new generation of conservative artists to take over the genre. Much of the big names in older country music, such as Johnny Cash and Dolly Parton, are known liberals whose politics obviously clashed with the conservatives who tried to claim their music as their own. The same issue doesn't exist with many new artists, although shifts in the world of country music could point to this soon not being true. Take, for example, Lil Nas X's Old Town Road, a chart-topping country song by a gay black man, which is not the typical modern country singer. Hope It for a New Life for the genre can be seen in the hearts of many who miss the old, outlaw-loving, storytelling songs of the past. Pete Seeger's attempts to permanently imbue country music with leftist politics obviously failed, but the legend of him lives on in other genres, most prominently perhaps in punk and its subgenres. Punk subculture, including its music, retains heavily leftist influences, without which punk wouldn't be punk. Seeger's direct effect on the genre can be seen in the band X, which took much of its inspiration from Woody Guthrie, Seeger's prodigy. An example of this is in the song I Must Not Think Bad Thoughts, where Woody Guthrie is mentioned by name. Larger influences from Seeger, as well as of country music, can be seen in the use of music as a form of protest and rebellion. Country music, even before Seeger, included a fair amount of romanticization of rebelling against the establishment, such as numerous songs talking about Western outlaws, and even Loretta Lynn's controversial song, The Pill, although that was after Seeger. It is a part of country's roots that has unfortunately been lost in more recent years. Today it is hard to imagine most modern genres of music without their political elements, as well as most artists without their political elements, which is something we have partially to thank Pete Seeger for. Country, from its origins in the rural areas of America to its commercialization in the 1920s radio scene and its complicated political past, represents over a century's worth of music history. The idea of a communist country singer today sounds like insanity, but America's folk music has a tangled history with the ideology, some of which still persists in famous songs such as Woody Guthrie's This Land Is Your Land. Conservatism radically changed what it means to be a country singer and what a country song sounds like, but Seeger's influences can now be seen in other genres of music. As John Langford, a member of the Welsh post-punk band Meccans, pointed out in an interview with Alexander Billett for Jacobin magazine, genres like punk are now surprisingly similar to earlier country. It was sad for me, and quoting Langford, it was sad for me when country music went all urban cowboy and Garth Brooks, and people started dressing like idiots from the suburbs instead of cowboys. Country music, it's a folk art. It was a functional art form. There's a parallel with punk rock. It's people's songs. People were telling stories that were universal in some way and part of real life. Country music has evolved greatly over the last century or so of its existence. For better or for worse, is up to the individual to decide. What the future may bring to the genre is yet unknown, but change is certain to come.